Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. The Ocean Leech by Frank Belknap Long. Weird Tales, January 1925. I heard Buka beating with his bare fists upon the cabin door and the wind whistling under the cracks. I objected to both, and I opened the door wide. Buka came in then, with a fierce rush of wind. He was a curious little man, with the sea and sky in his eyes, and he spoke in pantomime. He pointed towards the door and ran his fingers savagely through his reddish hair, and I knew that something had nearly finished him. I mean finished him spiritually, damaged his soul, his outlook. I didn't know whether to be pleased or horrified. Buka seemed more human with his queer, vivid gestures and flaming eyes, but I couldn't imagine what he had seen up on deck. Of course I found out soon enough. The men were sitting about in idiotic groups of twos and threes, and no one saluted me when I stepped out from the shadows of twisted cordage into a luminous stripe of moonlight. "Where's the boatswain?" I asked. Several of the men heard my question, and they turned and stared at me, and deliberately tittered. "It took the boatswain," said Oscar. Oscar seldom spoke to anyone. He was tall and lean, and his jaundiced scalp was fringed by yellow hair. I distinctly recall his dark, hungry eyes and his fringe of hair glistening in the moonlight. But the rest of Oscar I can no longer visualize. He has faded into an indefinite ghost of memory. It is curious, though, how clearly I remember every other shape and incident of that amazing night. Oscar was standing by my elbow, and I turned suddenly and gripped his arm. It reassured me to grip his strong, muscular arm, but I knew that I had hurt him, for his shoulder jerked and he looked at me reproachfully. I presume Oscar wanted me to stand upon my own feet, but he made a sweeping motion with his arm to assure me that it didn't matter. The wind whistled about our ears, and the tattered sails flapped and wheezed. Sails can speak, you know. I have heard sails protest in chorus, each sail with a slightly different accent. You get to understand their conversation in time. On still mornings, it is wonderful to come up on deck and hear the sails whispering among themselves. They make gestures too, and when they are tired, they sway pathetically against the sky. I took a turn about the deck and bawled out the men and told them to go to the devil. Then I got my pipe out and blew grotesque yellow effigies into the cold air. They danced in the moonlight and made the situation irredeemable. I came back to Oscar eventually and asked him point blank what he meant by it. But Oscar didn't answer me. He simply turned and pointed. Something white and gelatinous oozed over the rail and ran or slid for several feet along the deck. Then a larger bulk seethed out of the darkness and stood poised above the black stern post. A second object descended upon the deck, coming down with a thud and running at a tangent with the first over the smooth, polished boards. I saw two of the men get quickly to their feet with wildish, jerky motions, and I heard Oscar shout out a curt command. The thing upon the deck spread out and became broader at its base. It reared into the air, a livid appendage encircled with monstrous pink suckers. We could see the suckers loathsomely at work in the moonlight, opening and closing and opening again. We were affected by a queer aromatic stench, and we felt an overpowering sense of physical nausea. I saw one of the men reel backward and collapse upon the boards. Then a second idiot keeled over, and a third actually advanced toward the loathsome object on his hands and knees, as if fascinated. At that moment, the moon seemed to draw nearer, to actually careen down the sky and hang above the cordage. Then suddenly the amorphous tentacles shot forward, like released hawsers, and struck against the nearest mast, and I heard a splintering and a noise like thunder. The arms quivered and seemed to fly in all directions. Then they flopped back over the side. I fastened my eyes upon our black topsail mastheads and questioned Oscar in a very low voice. "Did that take the boatswain?" Oscar nodded and shuffled his feet. The men on the deck whispered among themselves, and I knew intuitively that a spirit of rebellion was rife among them. And yet even Oscar exonerated me. Where would we have been if you hadn't brought us in here? Adrift, probably, rudderless and sailless. Our sails may look like the skin on a waterlogged corpse, but we can use them when we can get the masts into shape. The lagoon looked innocent enough, and most of us were for coming in here. But now they whine like yellow puppies and blame it on you. The idiots! If you just say the word. I stopped him, for I didn't want the men to take his proposal seriously, and he spoke loud enough for them to hear. The men, I felt, were scarcely to blame under the circumstances. "How many times has the thing crawled over the sides?" I asked. "8 times, said Oscar. "It took the boatswain on the 3rd trip. He shrieked and threw up his arms and turned yellow. It twined itself about his leg and set its great pink suckers to work on him, and the rest of us could do nothing. Nothing. We tried to get him away, but you cannot imagine the sheer pull of that white arm. It oozed slime all over him and all over the deck. Then it flopped back into the water and carried him with it. After that, we were more careful. I told the men to go below, but they only glowered at me. The thing fascinates them. They sit there and deliberately wait for it to return. You saw what happened just now. The thing can strike like a cobra, and it sticks closer than a lamprey, but the idiots won't be warned. And when I think of those quivering pink suckers, I feel sorry for them, and for myself." He didn't utter a sound, you understand, but he turned livid under the gills and his tongue stuck out horribly, and just before he disappeared over the side, I noticed that his lips were all black and swollen. But as I told you, he was immersed in yellowish slime, in ooze, and the life must have gone out of him almost at once. I'm sure that he didn't really suffer. With God's help, it's we who have to suffer. "Oscar," I said, "I want you to be quite frank, and if necessary, even brutal. Do you think that you can explain that thing? I don't want any wretched theories, Oscar. I want you to fashion a prop for me, Oscar, something for me to lean upon. I'm so very tired, and I haven't much authority here. Oh, yes, I'm supposed to be in command, but when there is nothing to go upon, Oscar, what can I say to them? How can I get them down into the cabin? I pity them so. What do you think it is, my friend?" "The thing is obviously a cephalopod," said Oscar quite simply, but there was a look of shame and horror in his eyes, which I didn't like. "An octopus, Oscar. Perhaps, or a monstrous squid, or some hideous, unclassified species." A greenish cloud covered the face of the moon, and I saw one of the men crawling on his hands and knees along the deck. Then he gave a sudden defiant scream, ran to the rail, and held out his arms. A white exudation ran the entire length of the rail. It rose up and quivered amidst illimitable shadows, and then it poured in an abominable stream over the scuppers and enveloped the hectic form of the wretch. And it made no sound. The poor fool tried to get away. He screamed, made shocking grimaces, fell down upon the deck, and tried to draw himself along by his hands. He pawed at the smooth, slippery surface, but the thing had wound its tenebrous tentacles about his leg, and it pulled him. It pulled him slowly and hideously. His head struck against the scuppers, and a crimson stream, no wider than a hawser rope, ran down the deck and formed a miniature pool at Oscar's feet. A sucker fastened upon his right temple, and another got in under his shirt and set to work upon his bare chest. I tried to get to him, but Oscar held fast to my arm and would not tell me why. The body became white, slimy, changed before our eyes, and not one man stepped forward to prevent it. Suddenly, while we watched, the dead man, whose eyes had already glazed, was jerked forcefully toward the scuppers again and again. But he wouldn't go through. His head was soon pounded into an unimaginable resemblance of something we didn't care to think about, and we became deadly sick. But we watched, strangely fascinated, even perhaps more than a little resentful. We were watching something brutal and incredibly alive, and we beheld it in an unrestrained exercise of all its faculties. There, under a shrouded moon, in the phosphorescent wilderness of exotic waters, we saw the law of man outraged by something mute, misshapen, blasphemous, and we saw industrious retching matter, brainless and self-sufficient, obeying a law older than man, older than morality, older than sin. Here was life absorbing another life, and doing it forcefully, and without conscience, and becoming stronger and more exultant through the doing of it. But it couldn't get the body through the scuppers. It pulled, and finally let go. The wind had gone down, and oddly enough, as it let go and fell back into the dead calm of the water, we heard an ominous splash. We rushed forward and surrounded the body. It seemed to swim in a river of white jelly. Oscar called for something which had become necessary, and we wrapped it up decently and threw it overboard. But Oscar repeated a few words mechanically out of the little black prayer book, which he imagined were appropriate. I stood and stared at the dark opening in the forecastle. I don't know to this day how I got the men through that dark opening, but I did it, with Oscar's aid. I can see Oscar standing with his glistening head against a voiceless wilderness of stars. I can see him shaking his fists at the slinking cowards on the deck and shrieking out commands. Or were they insults? I know that I stepped forward and helped him, and I think I must have used my fists, for later on I discovered that my knuckles were bruised and discolored, and Oscar had to bandage them. It is queer how Oscar has faded in my memory, for I thought a great deal of him, in spite of his queer ways, and his large hungry eyes, and his fringe of yellow hair. He helped me get the men into the forecastle, and so did Bouquet. Bouquet with a perfectly horrified face, and with lips quivering and struggling with a vicious inarticulateness. We drove them in like sheep, but sheep often rebel and are troublesome. But we got them in, and then we turned and looked back at the gaunt masts, swaying soullessly against the lifeless, somber regularity of calm sea and sky, at the hanging ropes and frizzled sails, and at the long, moon-washed rails, and the encrimsoned scuppers. We heard Bouc inside, blubbering idiotically to the men. Then something made a dreadful guggling sound in the water, and we heard a loud splash. "It's risen again," said Oscar, in a tone of despair. I sat in my cabin, reading a book. Oscar had bandaged up my hands and left, and he had promised not to disturb me. I endeavored to follow the little printed signs on the white page before me, but they called up no images, stimulated me to no response. The words did not take shape in my mind, and I did not know whether the stupid phrases that I sought to understand formed part of an essay or a short story. The title of the book itself I cannot now recall, although I think that it had something to do with ships and the sea and derelicts and the pitfalls of over-imaginative happenings. I fancied that I could hear the water lapping against the side of the ship, and now and then a great splash. But I knew that a portion of my brain hotly repudiated both the lapping and the splash, and I assured myself that the nervous excitement under which I labored was but physical and momentary, and in no sense psychic, or due to outside causes. My senses had been appalled, and now suffered a natural reaction from the shock, but no new danger threatened me. Something pounded upon the door. I got quickly to my feet, and it did not occur to me at that moment that Oscar had promised that no one should disturb me. "What is it you want?" I asked. There was no direct or satisfactory answer, but a queer guggling noise came to me through the door, and I fancied that I could hear a quick intake of breath. A horrible, intense fear took grim possession of me. I looked at the door in white horror. It shook like boards in a gale. It bent inward under a terrific impact. Thud followed thud, as if some monstrous body had hurled itself forward only to withdraw and to come back with additional momentum. I quelled an impulse to cry out, and I opened my mouth and shut it, and opened it again. I ran forward to assure myself that I had really bolted the door. I fingered the bolt caressingly, and then I retreated until my back was against an opposite beam. The door bulged inward hideously, and immediately afterward there followed a great crash, and a splintering and a sundering of wood, and a wrenching of hinges. The door gave, fell inward, and was lifted up on the back of something white and unspeakable. Then the panel was hurled violently against the wall, and the thing under it rolled forward with terrible and increasing velocity. It was a long, gelatinous arm, an amorphous tentacle with pink suckers that slid or oozed towards me across the smooth floor. I stood with my back pressed against the beam, with only my harsh, stertorous breathing to keep it at bay. I could see that it did not fear me, that arm, and I could do nothing. It was long and white, and it slid towards me. Can I make you understand? And Oscar had bandaged my hands, and they were but feeble, fumbling instruments. And that thing was utterly intent upon its purpose, and it did not need eyes to guide it across the floor. An ungodly, aromatic odor had entered the cabin with the thing, and it overpowered me almost before the tentacles seized upon me. I endeavored to slough off the great, loathsome folds with my bandaged hands, but my crippled fingers sank into the jelly-like tissue as in soft mud. It was palpitating, living tissue, but it seemed to lack substantial body, and it gave horribly. It gave. My hands went right through it, and yet when it gripped me it was elastic and it could tighten its grip. It strangled me. I felt that I could not breathe. I bent and twisted, but it had wound itself about me, and it held me, and I could do nothing. I remember that I called for Oscar. I shouted myself hoarse, and then I think I was dragged ruthlessly across the floor, through the smashed-in door, and up the stairs. I remember now how my head pounded upon the stairs as we ascended, I and the thing, and I think that my scalp bled, and I know that I lost 3 teeth. I received dreadful blows, cuffs, from the corners of stairs, from the edges of doors, and from the smooth, hard boards of the deck itself. The thing dragged me out across the deck, and I remember that I saw the moon through folds upon folds of obscenely bloating jelly. I was buried deep down within fatty, obscene folds that shivered and shook and palpitated in the moonlight. I no longer felt any desire to protest or to cry out, and the thought of Oscar and a possible rescue did not fill me with elation. I began to experience sensations of pleasure. How am I to describe them? A peculiar warmth pulsed through me. My limbs quivered with a weird expectancy. I saw through the folds of animate jelly a great reddish sucker, or disc, lined with silver teeth. I saw it descend rapidly through the folds. It fastened upon my chest, and a momentary revulsion made me claw ludicrously at the nauseous tissue surrounding me. There was a kind of cruelty in the refusal of the flimsy stuff to offer any resistance. One could go on that way forever, clawing and tearing at the fatty folds, and feeling them give, and yet knowing that nothing could possibly come of it. For one thing, it was utterly impossible to get a hold on the stuff, to get it between your hands and squeeze it. It simply flipped away from you, and then it rushed back and solidified. It could condense and dilate at will. My feeling of horror and antipathy disappeared, and a new tide of exaltation, of warmth, of vigor surged over me. I could have wept or screamed with pleasure and genuine ecstasy. I knew that the monster was actually drawing up my blood through its fumbling, convulsive suckers. I knew that in a moment I should be drained as dry as a grilled carbonado, but I actually welcomed my inevitable dissolution. I made no effort to conceal my glee. I was frankly hilarious, although it seemed unjust to me that Oscar should have to explain to the men. Poor Oscar. He tied up the loosened ends of things, smoothed over vulgar and disagreeable realities, made the raw, ungarnished facts almost acceptable, almost romantic. He was a precious stoic, and gloriously self-reliant. That I knew, and I pitied him. I distinctly recalled my last conversation with him. He was slouching along the docks, with his hands in his pockets and a cigarette between his teeth. "Oscar," I said, "I didn't really suffer when that thing fastened upon me." "I didn't really. I enjoyed it." He scowled and scratched his ridiculous fringe of hair. "Then I saved you from yourself," he cried. His eyes blazed, and I saw that he wanted to knock me down. That was the last I saw of Oscar. He faded into the shadows after that, but had I kept him with me, I might have been wiser. The jelly about me seemed to increase in volume. It must have been 3 feet thick about my head, and I am sure that I saw the moon and the swaying mastheads through a prism of varying colors. Waves of blue and scarlet and purple would pass before my eyes, and a taste of salt came into my mouth. For a moment I thought, not without a certain resentment and hurt pride, that the thing had really absorbed me, that I was a portion and parcel of that quivering, gelatinous mass. And then I saw Oscar. I saw him looming above my obscene prison house with a lighted torch in his hand. The torch, viewed through the magnifying folds of jelly, was a thing of flawless beauty. The flames shot out and appeared to cover the entire deck, and to go flying up against the darkness. The cordage and the luminous rails seemed afire, and a red and ravening serpent lengthened parallel with the scuppers. I saw Oscar clearly, and I saw the great spiral of smoke that streamed from the tails of flame, and I saw the swaying, ensimbsoned masts and the black sinister opening in the forecastle. The darkness seemed to part to let Oscar through with his torch and his stoicism. He swayed in the darkness above me, that silent, quixotic man, and I knew that Oscar could be trusted to put an end to things. I had no clear idea of what Oscar would do, but I knew that he would make some sort of brilliant and satisfying end. I was not disappointed, and when I saw Oscar bend and touch the folds of jelly with his great flaming torch, I wanted to sing or shout. The folds quivered and changed color. A maddening kaleidoscope of color passed before my eyes, flaming scarlet and yellow and silver and green and gold. The sucker released its hold upon my chest and shot upward through the voluminous folds. A terrific stench assailed my nostrils. The odor was unbearable. I threw out my arms and fought savagely to break through to reach the air and light and Oscar. Then I felt the heat of Oscar's torch upon my cheek, and I knew that the tissue about me was falling away and burning to shreds. I saw that it was dissolving also, turning into oil, into grease, and I felt it hotly trickling down my knees and arms and thighs. I closed my lips tight to keep from swallowing large quantities of the nauseous fluid, and I turned my face to the deck to protect my eyes from the falling fragments of sizzling tissue. The creature was literally being burnt alive, and in my heart of hearts, I pitied it. When Oscar at length helped me to my feet, I saw the last of the thing disappear over the side. Its arms were horribly charred and the suckers were gone, and I caught a momentary glimpse of dangling frayed ends and reddish knobs and bulging protuberances. Then we heard a splash and a queer gurgling sound. We looked at the deck and saw that it was covered with greenish oil, and here and there great solid chunks of burnt tissue swam in the hideous porridge. Oscar bent and picked up one of the fragments. He turned it right side up in his hand, so that the moonlight fell upon it. It contained in its 5-inch expanse a 4-inch sucker, and the sucker opened and closed while Oscar held the thing in his hand. It fell from Oscar's hand like a leaden weight and bounded into the air. Oscar kicked it overboard and looked at me. I looked away towards the black topsail masthead. End of The Ocean Leech by Frank Belknap Long. The Sea Thing by Frank Belknap Long. Weird Tales, December 1925. July 16th. We are caught in one of the great calms. There is water in the well, and our food is nearly gone. Everything is hidden from view by the fog. I confess that I am a hopeless coward. The situation appalls me. What an expressive word is despair. I shall write it large. Despair. Luckily, a flying fish came scudding over the rails this morning. July 17th. The fog has lifted, but there is no relief in sight, and the water in the well has risen several inches. The 7 of us worked on the pumps all night. Thompson seemed surly and inclined to rebel. He is a man to be envied. He still retains his egoism and fancies himself a very shrewd and important person. I hadn't the heart to be angry with him. Poor devil. He doesn't know how near we are to the rocks. I speak figuratively, of course. We are at present in the open sea, 1,000 miles from land, and our rudder has gone by the board. We drift aimlessly. A fine situation, truly, for the skipper of the Octopus. 3 months ago I had a full crew, and full sails, and now. Cholera isn't pleasant. Damn it all. Cholera is not pleasant. July 18th. I have given up all hope. By working desperately, we are able to keep the water in the well from rising, but our food has given out. We have pumped and cursed on empty stomachs for 15 hours. Bullen collapsed. He collapsed like the others, but thank God his face didn't turn black. We are done with the cholera now. I'll stake my reputation on that. My prompt disposal of the bodies nipped the cholera in the bud. In the bud, did I say? Ha! When a man loses 3/4 of his crew, he can't think straight. The cholera really ran its course. It couldn't have lasted much longer. I wish to heaven that it had taken the rest of us. July 19th. It was funny. Another flying fish came aboard today, and Tommy Wells made a dive for it. He dived after it head first, with arms akimbo like a man just awakened from some crazy dream, and he slid along the planks. But he got the fish. He caught it between his 2 hands and bit into it, and finally disposed of it, bones and all. That was a devilish thing to do, said Thompson. Big Johnny Boltzig cursed horribly. I felt rather light in the head, and I didn't say anything, but I was a bit put out. We could have divided the flying fish up, but as I say, it was funny. July 20. Our case is desperate. There isn't a breath of air stirring, and Boltzig has joined Bullen. They are both below, unable to move an arm between them, and Bullen is very near death. Curiously enough, though, the 5 of us are able to keep the water down. But we are tired. Tired. July 21. We have one thing to be thankful for. The water has not risen an inch in 12 hours, and we didn't pump. We are too tired to pump. We lay about on the decks, and cursed and made faces at the sky, and we never mentioned food. But Thompson's tongue stuck out queerly. "Put that rag in your mouth," I shouted. It was a coarse remark to make to a starving man, but I was suffering acutely. Why do I continue to write in this log? July 22. We are saved. Who could have anticipated such glorious good luck? A boatload of provisions and a jolly companion to cheer us up. He claims that he is the sole survivor of the Princess Clara. You have undoubtedly heard of the princess. A finer brig never put out from Frisco, and she's gone. A hurricane and a leak did for her. 6 or 7 got away in the longboat, but my friend, I call him that, because he has saved us all, my friend threw them overboard. They died first, of course. Get that straight. They died from fright or from drinking salt water, and my friend didn't like the company of corpses, so he just naturally disposed of them. That's his story, and I accept it at its face value. I'm not a man to go poking about and asking questions. It's enough that he's brought us provisions and jolly companionship. We were growing weary of each other, we 7. He calls himself Francis de la Vega. July 24. Divigi, we call him Vigi, has been with us now for 3 days. He has the run of the ship, and I have given him the mate's cabin. The mate has no further need for a cabin since he spends his nights on the ocean floor. A splendid chap, the mate. He was the first to go. But I mustn't rake up old ashes. Deveji is tall and amazingly lean, and I never saw a paler man. His face is drawn and haggard and his eyes large, and they consume you. There is something devastating about his eyes. Sometimes they seem 100 years old. His forehead is high and as yellow and dry as parchment, and his nose is curved like a scimitar. Strangely enough, he reminds me of Poe's usher. I say strangely enough because the man has nothing but his appearance in common with the aristocratic neurotic of Poe's tale. He is boyish, gay, and utterly free from gloom. His manner is ingenuous and charming. He is all smiles and assurance, and he tells stories that are almost Rabelaisian in their frank, coarse humor. He possesses a remarkable knowledge of medicine, or perhaps I should say of healing, since he uses no drugs. But he has completely restored Bullen and Big Johnny Boltzig. The 8 of us make a jolly crew. He has given us new life, new confidence. His presence is a delight to us. There is one thing curious about him. His hands are cold and almost lifeless. There is no blood in them. I never before saw such hands on a human being. And the nails are astonishingly long. July 27. Deveji has kept more to himself. He remained locked in his cabin this morning and answered my anxious questions through the keyhole. But I was too busy to show surprise. There was a curious chill in the air which promised wind, and Thompson, Wells and I worked desperately to get up the topgallants and strengthen the weather leeches. The rest were too tired to work, and I did not press them. I have no desire to reassert my authority just yet. The first sign of a breeze will increase the crew's morale, and then I hope to regain my old power of discipline. July 28. I am worried about Deveji. This morning he came on deck looking so drawn and haggard that I left the taffrail where I had been standing with one hand grasping the weather vang and crossed the deck to comfort him. His eyes looked appealingly into mine. "Couldn't sleep all night," he said. "The ship tosses so. The great calms certainly make a ship roll." "They do," I replied, "but you don't notice the roll so much on deck. If you wish, you may carry your bedding up and sleep with the boys on the planks. But don't be startled if a flying fish flops in your face." Deveji smiled. "Thanks," he said. "The idea appeals to me. I'll act on it tonight." July 29. A breeze is surely coming soon. All of the signs point to it. I have been working frantically on a miserable substitute for a rudder. I think that I shall be able to steer fairly well in a pinch, but I hope the breeze doesn't come until we are better prepared. Deveji slept on the planks with the crew last night, and this morning he looks 10 years younger. His cheeks are flushed and full, and the greenish hollows have disappeared from under his eyes. But Thompson isn't well. He complains of pains in his chest, and once or twice he spat blood. He is abnormally pale. July 30. Still no breeze. Thompson is sick unto death. He lies in his cabin and groans, and I can do nothing for him. His pallor is genuinely alarming. Even his lips are bloodless. He complains of noises in his ears, and Deveji has shown his first gleam of ill nature. "I can do nothing for him," he says, and shrugs his shoulders. His eyes smolder when he speaks, and I discern for the first time a hard cruelty in the man. He is not what he pretends to be. July 31st. Thompson died this morning, and Deveji actually gloated over his death. What does it mean? Why such a sudden change in a man who owes everything to our generosity? It is true that his coming supplied us with food, but we snatched him from the very maws of the sea. That is ingratitude for you. Human beings are utterly despicable, and I have lost faith in them. Deveji does not differ from the rest. He gloats over the misfortunes of others. He actually smiled when I read the burial service and dropped poor Thompson into the sea. Imagine it. August. There is still no wind. I should welcome any sort of breeze after what I felt today. There is something unnatural about this ship. Even the cook has noticed it. It ain't natural, he said, for a ship to smell like this, and that Diverge's fellow's cabin. Phew! It not only stunk, but I laid my hand over his mouth. You're an idiot, I shouted. Diverge's all right. I don't know what made him smile yesterday when I shipped off poor Thompson, but he isn't a bad sort. I lowered my voice. He never complains, and his companionship is jolly stimulating. The boys couldn't get along without him. You have a feeling that he knows more than 10 ordinary men whenever he opens his mouth to tell one of his amazing yarns. And that tale of the Spanish Inquisition that he frightened Boelzig with yesterday morning was so real, so vivid. I alias distrusted him, said the perverse fool. I grimaced, and remarked coolly that nothing could be more absurd than the prejudices of a lazy son of a sea cook. But I must confess that the smell of Diverge's cabin did horrify me. I had entered it while Diverge was on deck, and the stench nearly laid me on my back. The place smelt like a hellish charnel house. The odor of decaying shellfish mingled with a peculiarly offensive and acrid smell that in some indefinable way suggested newly shed blood. There was no sign, however, of anything amiss in the cabin. I was so horrified that I left almost immediately, slamming the door with a bang. Tonight I shall drink heavily. Oh, I shall get gloriously drunk. I shall make a fool of myself. But what does it matter? August 2nd. Diverge has grown hard and cynical. He curses my men and refuses to speak to me. This morning little Tommy Wells went below and lay down. He was as white as a squid's belly. Something told me to examine him. I commanded him to strip, and I searched his entire body for signs of discoloration. I thought that possibly the cholera had taken a new form. Like influenza, cholera may manifest itself in curious and amazing ways. I had never read of cholera draining the blood from a man, but I wasn't taking any chances. Well, it wasn't cholera. It was a bite. Something had bitten him on the chest. A round, circular discoloration disfigured the center of his chest, and in the very middle were 2 sharp incisions, from which blood and pus trickled ominously. I didn't like it, neither did Tommy. When he saw the wound, he sat up very stiff and straight, and asked me if I knew any tropic insects capable of such devilry. There are no insects 1,000 miles from land, I shouted. Don't be such an incredible imbecile. Tommy looked at me reproachfully. Flies, he said. They're often found on board. You know that just as well as I do. This stinking hold would breed 'em as big as whales. It couldn't have been anything else. I didn't feel it at all. Didn't even know that I had the bite. There's something more than flies in this, Tommy, I said. The thing that bit you came out of the sea. Ever see a lamprey's wound on a fish, Tommy? Did I ever see a man walking with his legs? Snapped Tommy. But how could a lamprey get me? I didn't sleep on the bottom of the sea. I slept on deck, and I was covered up. I suppose your lamprey climbed over the rail and walked about, and finally decided that I would make a good juicy meal. Then I dare say he lifted the blanket and crawled under my shirt and fed until morning. He would be wise enough, of course, to get away and over the side before daybreak. Is that your theory, Captain? I was curiously impatient with the boy. His levity had somehow stung me. It's a better theory than your flies, I responded. Tommy smiled grimly and turned over in his bunk. August 3. Tonight I went down into the pit. Something walks at night in this ship. The pestilence that walketh at nightfall. I wonder if the Hebrew prophet saw what I felt. I awoke from a heavy sleep, and something that does not sleep was standing above my bed. The cabin was wrapped in a velvety blackness, and I could see nothing, not even a shadow. But I heard it gulp, and I smelt. The odor of decay was so strong that it stung my nostrils. And I heard the thing above me gulp. It didn't breathe or whisper or cry out, but it simply gulped. I tried to rise, but it laid its hand on my head and forced me back. And its hand was slimy, like the hand of a frog. August 4th. An unaccountable incident occurred on deck today. I am obliged to believe that Daviji is insane. Red Walker was working on the braces, and his hand accidentally slipped. He cut himself badly. The blood ran down his arm, and we all feared that he had severed an artery. His underlip trembled, but he didn't complain or cry out. He simply walked with unsteady steps toward the forecastle, while he sought to stanch the flow of blood with his uninjured hand. Daviji was standing above the lee scuppers, and the sight somehow startled him. He threw up his arms and ran straight for Red. Red saw him coming and stopped, puzzled and a little hopeful. He recalled Daviji's power of healing. In a moment, Daviji had seized upon the injured arm. He gripped it forcefully and put it under his shirt. He held Red Walker's wrist against his chest, and he seemed horribly excited. His eyes bulged. His cheeks turned grey, and balls of sweat accumulated on his forehead. Daviji was making a tremendous effort to achieve something, but we couldn't guess what. The situation was uncanny. I stepped forward to interfere, but when I reached them they were free of each other, and Red was examining his arm with horror and amazement. "There's no blood in it," he groaned, "and my God, it's as cold as ice." Daviji scowled. "I didn't expect gratitude," he said dryly, "but you have no right to complain. I fixed your wrist for you. It won't bleed again for some time." I could only stare. Is Daviji mad, or has he mastered some monstrous system of healing? August 5th. Red Walker is dead. I disposed of his body this morning. It was white and rigid, and I noticed an extraordinary discoloration above the wound on his wrist. From the elbow down, his arm was bright green. I cannot explain it. Blood poisoning, perhaps, but I do not like Daviji. I no longer trust him. His presence has become obnoxious to me. August 6. I am stunned, frightened. Who could have dreamed? Who could have expected? The thing is so incredible, so hideous, so utterly outside human experience. I found the book in the ship's library. It was one of 40 water-soaked volumes. It was a very ancient book, and the leaves were yellow and the cover eaten away at the corners. It was dated 1823. But that is not strange. Books 100 years old are not uncommon on clipper ships that should have been scuttled before the beginning of this century. I had poked among the absurd books out of curiosity, incidentally seeking something to read that would lift me above a gruesome world of sea and sky and walking pestilence. I turned the pages of the little book rapidly and laughed at the ridiculous lore that graced its soiled yellow pages. It was a miscellany, bearing the title, A Writer's Evening, and the incongruity of such a book among such surroundings amused and delighted me. And then I discovered the following passage, and I had no longer any desire to laugh. According to Father Feiju, in the month of June 1671, some young men were waiting by the sea in Bilbon, when one of them, named Francis de Juveji, suddenly leaped into the sea and disappeared presently. About 5 years afterwards, some fishermen in the environs of Cadiz perceived the figure of a man swimming and sometimes plunging under the water. It is said that his body was entirely covered with scales. They also added that different parts of his body were as hard as shipwood. Father Feiju adds many philosophic reflections on the existence of this phenomenon and on the means by which a man may be enabled to live at the bottom of the sea. August 7th. This morning I showed Tommy Wells the miscellany. He read it slowly, and his face actually turned yellow. His small blue eyes narrowed. "We must act at once," he said. "Later we have made our plans. Tommy and I are to bunk together tonight. We have automatics and a sharp knife. The knife, we feel, will be necessary. This morning Tommy and I discussed vampirism. A stake or knife must be driven through the heart," said Tommy. But a sea vampire, Tommy, I responded, is different. Tommy shrugged, to conceal the horror and uncertainty in his tired brain. We are resolved to do everything possible. August 8. It is over. Poor Tommy is gone, but Deveji will trouble us no more. I am dazed, horrified, but I must write it all. It is a duty I owe to Tommy. He would want it on record. Tommy was always methodical, and he insisted on regulations. I must put it in the log to please Tommy. We were awake in our bunks when the door opened. We heard the door creak on its hinges. Something unutterable had entered the room. We could hear the thing gulp. Tommy gripped my arm, and I got ready to strike a match. I waited until its soft, slimy approach became unbearable. I waited until it stood at the foot of my bunk, and until its green, glassy eyes were vaguely discernible in the almost total blackness. It was watching me, and I realized that it could see in the dark. I lit the match. My hand shook frightfully, but I carried the match to the tallow wick, and then it sprang. But it didn't spring at me. It went higher, and it got Tommy about the neck. I could hear him choke and gasp. In passing me, the thing had knocked the match from my fingers, and we were once more in total darkness. I had seen something long and green and slimy going upward, and I had heard Tommy's frightful scream. But I saw and heard nothing else for the space of 30 or 40 seconds. I was unable to move or think. I sat on the edge of my bunk, and my heart came up in my throat and flopped over. I was conscious of two objects struggling and gasping on the floor. I heard gulping and a low moaning, and then the night was loud with Tommy's screams. He shrieked and shrieked and shrieked, and between the screams there came a torrent of jumbled nouns and adjectives. Green, eyes, ooze, mouth, wet. I finally got out another match and struck it. I kept my eyes averted and carried the match rapidly to the candle wick. I knew that if my eyes fastened upon the thing on the floor, I should drop the match. I waited until the wick flared, and then I looked. Something was on top of Tommy. It covered him, and seemed apparently about to absorb him. In its evil, distorted features and long-nailed hands, I recognized a caricature of Deveji, but the evil in the man had sprouted. It had turned him into a jellyfish, fishy monstrosity. His legs and arms actually gave. They were like nothing in this world under the sun and moon and stars. They lengthened and enveloped and choked Tommy. But the worst of all, the body of the thing was covered with greenish scales, and it had pink suckers on its chest. The suckers were lustily at work on poor Tommy. The suckers were draining Tommy dry. His screams kept getting louder and louder, and he muttered pathetic invocations and shameless blasphemies, and his scared eyes watched me. There was a challenge and a mute appeal in them. I thought of the revolver in my bunk. I turned, and my fingers sought frantically for the weapon. At length I found it. I gripped the butt and leveled it. I leveled it at Tommy and the thing on the floor. I fired at Tommy and the thing. I had no intention of sparing Tommy. I knew that Tommy would not want that. The appeal in Tommy's suffering eyes was unmistakable. After that, objects refused to retain their identity in my sight. They coalesced and separated and came together again. The objects on the floor merged with the table and chairs and bunk ends. I have a vague recollection of carrying two bodies on deck and dumping them overboard. I remember that one body was long and slimy and strangely heavy. The other was amazingly light. Before I carried the long, heavy body on deck, I drove a knife through its heart. I think that the blood spurted out and spattered my arms and legs. But the memory of this occurrence is more vague than the shadow of a dream. Did the long green body groan when I stabbed it, and did a look of ineffable happiness and gratitude come into its eyes? Did the small body also speak to me before I carried it on deck? Did I later go into Deveji's cabin and breathe the fresh, clean air that blew through it? I cannot answer these questions, but I do not think that they require an answer. August 9th. A breeze, a breeze. The great calm is broken, and all hands are busy forward. I thank God that by tonight we shall be headed toward Frisco. End of the Sea Thing by Frank Belknap Long. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.